Owen came back from the dead with a horrifying message from heaven, and it shook the entire town to its core. The town was stunned when he returned with eyes full of fear and an urgent warning no one could ignore. But no one could have prepared for the chilling warning Owen carried from beyond the grave. What could possibly be so terrible that it forced a boy to come back from the grave? Let us uncover the shocking truth behind what he saw that caused his family to flee the town under the shadows of the night. The day that changed everything. The days passed with a steady rhythm for the family. Mornings were filled with the youngest dashing off to school, a backpack bouncing on his shoulders, and afternoons spent exploring the woods near their house. Jack worked long shifts at the local factory, while Liz balanced the chaos of home life and part-time work at the bakery. Emily and Grace, both in high school, had their share of teenage drama, but always found time to tease their younger brother. Weekends were sacred: family dinners, movie nights, and trips to the park. It was a life stitched together with love and routine. Before we dive deeper, it's clear that what he revealed that night is far more terrifying than anyone could have predicted, and this will not be the only chilling truth to come. On a crisp autumn day, the leaves painted the ground in fiery reds and oranges. The youngest had convinced his mom to let him ride his bike down to the park. "Stay on the main roads," Liz had said, her voice firm but warm. He had nodded earnestly, as he always did when he wanted permission for something. His bike was a hand-me-down from Emily, with scratches on the frame and a squeaky chain, but he loved it like it was brand new. It was freedom on two wheels. As the afternoon wore on, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the streets. He was making his way back home, a little later than planned. The wind tugged at his jacket as he pedaled hard, eager to avoid his mom's disapproving look. He'd taken a detour through a quiet road lined with trees. It wasn't far from home, but it was unfamiliar territory. It happened in the blink of an eye. A car came out of nowhere, speeding down the narrow road. He heard the roar of the engine before he saw it, his heart leaping into his throat. The driver's face was a blur of panic as the car swerved, trying to avoid him, but the bike skidded, the wheels losing grip on the loose gravel. He fell, his body colliding with the cold, hard ground, and then nothing. Silence. When his eyes fluttered open, the world was a spinning haze of lights and voices. Paramedics were there, their movements quick and efficient. Liz arrived moments later, her face pale, her hands trembling. Jack wasn't far behind, his rugged composure cracking as he saw his son lying still on the stretcher. Emily and Grace clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces. "We're losing him," one of the paramedics said, the words slicing through the air like a knife. They worked tirelessly, their hands moving with precision, but his small body grew still. Liz's sobs filled the void, her cries a raw, aching sound that echoed in the hearts of everyone present. Jack fell to his knees, his hands covering his face. The world seemed to hold his breath. Time stretched, each second heavier than the last, until one of the paramedics finally looked up, his face shadowed with sorrow. "Time of death, 5:32 p.m., he said quietly. The words landed like a thunderclap, final and irreversible. The family was shattered, their lives irreparably changed in a single cruel moment. But this wasn't the end for him. It was only the beginning. The air around him seemed heavy, as if time itself had frozen in place. He was floating, weightless, above the scene of his own lifeless body. The sight was surreal. His mother's anguished cries, his father's despair, his sister's tear-streaked faces. Yet, from this vantage point, their emotions felt distant, muted, like watching a play unfold behind glass. He reached out, instinctively trying to touch his mother's shoulder, to comfort her, but his hand passed through her as if he were made of mist. A strange pull tugged at him, drawing his attention upward. The world below seemed to blur and fade, replaced by a warm, inviting light. It wasn't just light, it was a presence, an overwhelming feeling of peace and acceptance. He felt his fears melting away as he drifted closer, as if this was where he was meant to be. The light seemed to call to him, wrapping him in a comforting glow. But then, a jarring sensation gripped him. It was as though invisible hands had seized him, halting his ascent. A voice, low and resonant, whispered his name. Owen, it said, echoing in his mind. The warmth of the light faltered, replaced by a cold unease. He looked back, away from the brightness, and saw the faint outline of shadows in the distance. They were shifting, moving, watching. Don't go, the voice warned, pulling him closer to the shadows. There is more you must know. His heart raced. The light still beckoned him, its serenity tantalizing, but the voice had a gravity he couldn't ignore. Against his will, he felt himself being drawn away from the light and toward the unsettling presence of the shadows. The world around him transformed. He found himself in a landscape that seemed both beautiful and haunting. The ground was soft and luminous, like walking on clouds, yet the air was heavy with whispers. They were faint at first, like wind rustling through leaves, but soon they grew louder, distinct words rising from the murmur. "Help us," they pleaded. "Don't leave us here." His chest tightened as he looked around, searching for the source of the voices. In the distance, he saw figures. They were vague and indistinct, their forms flickering like shadows caught in candlelight. Some reached out to him, their faces twisted in desperation. He wanted to run, to flee back toward the light, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. The voice from before returned, stronger now. "You cannot leave," it said. "Not yet." The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The clouds above seemed darker now, their edges tinged with gray. The brightness of the heavenly landscape dimmed, and he felt a growing sense of unease. This place, for all its beauty, was not what it seemed. As he walked, the terrain shifted beneath him. What had once been soft clouds grew firm and cold, like polished stone. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. He saw glimpses of others, lost souls, their eyes hollow, their hands clutching at the empty air. They seemed trapped, caught in a limbo that he couldn't understand. He tried to speak to them, but his voice failed him, his words swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A towering figure, cloaked in shadows, stood at the edge of the horizon. Its presence was overwhelming, both majestic and terrifying. As he approached, the figure turned toward him, and he felt an icy chill wash over him. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a profound sense of insignificance. This being was more than human, more than anything he could comprehend. The figure's voice boomed, resonating in the air and within his very soul. "There is something you must see," it said. The words were both a command and a warning, leaving no room for argument. He felt the pull again, stronger than before, as if invisible chains were dragging him forward. The figure's gaze bore into him, and he knew that whatever lay ahead, it would change him forever. The pain of what happened stayed with everyone, but something strange was pulling Owen toward what would come next. The voice that called him back. The air grew colder, and the towering figure raised a hand. With a wave, the serene yet unsettling landscape around Owen began to shift. What had once been clouds and light dissolved into darkness, replaced by scenes that felt all too real. It was like watching the world unravel from a vantage point no one was meant to see. The figure's voice, deep and commanding, echoed through the void. "Watch closely," it said. "What you see is not yet written in stone, but it is closer than you think." Before Owen could question the meaning, the visions began. A city appeared before him, vibrant and bustling, filled with life. But in an instant, the scene shifted. Buildings crumbled as a massive earthquake tore through the streets. People screamed, their cries of terror blending with the deafening roar of destruction. Fires erupted, painting the sky with smoke and ash. Owen's stomach churned as he watched helplessly. He tried to look away, but the vision held him captive. The scene changed again. This time it was a vast forest, green and teeming with life, but the serenity was short-lived. Machines tore through the trees, leaving devastation in their wake. Rivers ran black with pollution, and the once clear skies turned gray. Animals fled, their cries echoing in Owen's ears. The figure spoke again, its voice heavy with sorrow. "This is the cost of unchecked greed," it said. The world suffers because of choices made without thought for tomorrow. Owen's breath quickened as the visions continued. He saw nations rising against each other, their leaders shouting in anger. The ground was stained red with the blood of countless lives lost to war. The skies darkened, not with clouds, but with ash and fire from endless bombings. Families huddled together in fear, their faces etched with despair. Owen's chest tightened as he realized these were not just random events. They were warnings, glimpses of a future that felt terrifyingly plausible. The next vision was perhaps the most chilling. He saw a crowd of people, their faces twisted in torment. They were trapped in a gray, lifeless landscape, their voices rising in desperate cries for mercy. "Forgive us," they screamed, their words a haunting chorus. But there was no reply, no sign of salvation. They reached out, their hands clawing at the empty air, but it was too late. Owen's heart ached at the sight, his own tears blurring the harrowing image. The figure's voice broke through the cacophony. "Do you see now? Humanity walks a fragile path. There is still time to change course, but the window grows smaller with each passing day." Owen turned to the figure, his voice trembling. "Why are you showing me this? What can I do?" The figure's eyes, or what passed for them, seemed to pierce into Owen's soul. "Because you must warn them," it said. "This burden is yours now. The choice to carry it will not be easy, but it is one only you can make." The weight of the figure's words settled on Owen like a heavy cloak. He wanted to protest, to argue that he was just a boy, that this responsibility was too much for him to bear. But deep down, he knew the truth. The visions he had seen, the cries he had heard, they were a call to action, a plea from a world on the brink. "Please," Owen whispered, his voice breaking. "Send me back. I'll do whatever it takes." The figure was silent for a long moment, its gaze unwavering. Finally it spoke, its tone firm but not unkind. "Very well, but know this, the path ahead will be fraught with challenges. The burden you carry will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine. Be strong, Owen. For the world's sake, be strong." With those final words, the darkness around Owen began to dissolve. The visions faded, replaced by a blinding light that enveloped him completely. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The fluorescent lights of the hospital room flickered overhead as Owen's eyelids fluttered open. The world around him felt surreal, as if he were caught between waking and dreaming. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each one feeling foreign yet grounding. Voices pierced through the haze, his mother's frantic sobs, the murmured astonishment of doctors. He blinked, focusing on Liz's tear-streaked face hovering above him. "He's awake," someone whispered, their voice trembling with disbelief. A nurse leaned over to check his pulse, her hands shaking slightly. The room was a whirlwind of movement, monitors beeping as medical staff scrambled to make sense of what they were witnessing. It wasn't just that Owen was alive, it was how he'd come back. Minutes earlier, he had been declared dead, his heart silent, his body lifeless. Yet here he was, blinking up at the ceiling, very much alive. Liz clutched Owen's hand, her grip firm but trembling. "Owen," she choked out, her voice cracking. You're back." Her tears fell freely, splashing onto his blanket. Jack stood frozen at the foot of the bed, his face a mask of shock and relief, while Emily and Grace huddled together, their expressions a mix of awe and fear. Owen's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. His throat felt raw, his body weak, but the memories of what he'd seen were vivid and unrelenting. The figure, the visions, the cries of despair, they replayed in his mind like a relentless loop. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw." The doctors exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. One of them, a graying man with kind eyes, leaned closer. "Take it easy, son," he said gently. "You've been through a lot. We'll run some tests, but for now, just rest." But Owen couldn't rest. A burning urgency had taken hold of him, a need to speak, to share what he'd witnessed. Yet the words wouldn't come, trapped somewhere between his mind and his mouth. He closed his eyes, willing the images to fade, but they clung to him, vivid and unrelenting. Over the next few days, Owen's recovery became the talk of the hospital. Nurses whispered about the miracle boy who defied death, while doctors struggled to explain his revival. Liz refused to leave his side, her maternal instincts on high alert, while Jack tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for Emily and Grace. But it was clear to everyone that something had changed. Owen wasn't the same boy who had left on his bike that fateful day. He was quieter now, his once bright demeanor replaced with a solemn intensity. His eyes, once filled with youthful mischief, seemed older, as if they carried the weight of things no 12-year-old should ever know. His voice, when he spoke, carried a gravity that made people pause and listen, even when he said the simplest things. "The rain will stop soon," he murmured one afternoon, his gaze distant. Moments later, the storm outside ceased, the clouds parting to reveal a bright sky. It wasn't the first time he'd made such a statement, and each one left those around him uneasy. How could he know these things? And yet, he did. As the days turned into weeks, Owen's behavior grew even more perplexing. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," he would whisper, though he never explained who they were. Liz and Jack chalked it up to trauma, the lingering effects of his near-death experience. But Emily and Grace weren't so sure. They'd seen the way Owen's gaze would linger on things that weren't there, the way he'd speak as if answering questions only he could hear. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Owen finally broke his silence. His fork clattered against his plate as he looked up, his expression grave. "We're running out of time," he said, his voice steady but filled with an urgency that made everyone stop and stare. Jack frowned, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean, buddy?" Owen didn't answer. Instead, he pushed back his chair and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Liz started to follow, but Jack placed a hand on her arm, shaking his head. "Let him be," he said quietly. "He'll talk when he's ready." But Owen wasn't ready. Not yet. The weight of what he'd seen, of what he knew, was too much to bear. He spent hours alone in his room, staring out the window at the world beyond. It was a world he now saw differently, one teetering on the edge of something terrible. The visions had shown him a future filled with pain and despair, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was his responsibility to stop it. Late one night, Liz found Owen sitting on the floor of his room, his knees drawn to his chest. She sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "Talk to me, sweetheart," she said gently. "Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." Owen looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He hesitated, the words catching in his throat, but finally he whispered, "I saw something terrible, and it's coming for all of us." Owen couldn't ignore what he had seen, and he knew he had to tell others before things got worse. The town that refused to listen. The weight of his visions bore down on him, pressing him to act, to speak, to warn. At first, he shared what he saw cautiously, testing the waters with his family. Liz and Jack listened with a mix of concern and disbelief as he recounted the scenes of destruction, betrayal, and despair that had played out in his mind. He spoke of earthquakes swallowing entire cities, of floods washing away homes, and of people turning against each other in desperation. His voice trembled as he described leaders making decisions driven by greed, their actions sparking chaos that rippled across the globe. "This isn't just dreams," he insisted one evening as the family sat around the living room. "It's real. It's coming." His sisters exchanged uneasy glances, and Jack rubbed his temples, clearly struggling to make sense of it all. "Owen," Liz said gently, maybe you're still recovering. The accident, everything that happened, it's a lot for anyone to handle." But he shook his head. "It's not from the accident," he said, his voice firm. "I saw it. I was shown. And if we don't do something, it'll happen." As the days passed, his urgency grew. He began sharing his visions with friends at school, with neighbors, even with the local pastor. Some dismissed him outright, chalking it up to trauma or an overactive imagination. Others humored him, nodding politely before changing the subject. But there were a few who listened, really listened, and their reactions varied from cautious curiosity to outright fear. One afternoon, he spoke to Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived down the street. She'd always been kind to him, baking cookies and sharing stories about her younger years. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice low and serious, "I need to tell you something important." He described a storm, not just any storm, but one that would rip through their town with a fury unlike anything they'd ever seen. Trees would be uprooted, power lines would snap, and homes would be destroyed. Mrs. Henderson's face paled as he spoke, her hands trembling slightly. That sounds awful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But how can you know that?" "Because I've seen it," he replied, "and it's going to happen soon. You need to prepare." A week later, when a violent storm tore through the town, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake, Mrs. Henderson wasn't the only one who remembered his warning. Word began to spread, and more people started paying attention to the boy with the eerie predictions. Yet for every person who believed him, there were others who scoffed, accusing him of seeking attention or spreading fear. The strain of it all began to take its toll on him. He felt like he was carrying an impossible burden, one that grew heavier with each passing day. The visions didn't stop. If anything, they became more intense. They came not only in his sleep, but in waking moments, flashing before his eyes like fragments of a nightmare he couldn't escape. And always, the figure was there, watching, waiting. "You must move faster," the figure's voice echoed in one such waking dream. "Time is slipping away, and the warnings must be heard." His hands clenched into fists as he tried to push back against the mounting pressure. "I'm trying," he whispered, though no one was around to hear. "But they won't listen." The figure didn't respond, fading into the shadows as his vision returned to the present. He was standing in his bedroom, his heart racing and his body trembling. The whispers of the visions lingered, a constant reminder of what he'd seen and what he had to do. Desperate for relief, he turned to the pastor of the local church. Father Michael was a kind man, known for his compassion and open mind. He poured out his heart, recounting the visions and the warnings, hoping that someone with faith might understand. Father Michael listened intently, his expression unreadable. When he finished, the pastor leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "What you're describing, it's extraordinary," Father Michael said slowly. "But you must understand, people fear what they don't understand. Convincing them won't be easy, but it's true," he said, his voice cracking. "You have to believe me. If they don't listen, it'll be too late." Father Michael nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the truth is a heavy burden, but if you believe this is your purpose, you must keep trying, even if it feels like no one is listening." He left the church that day with a renewed sense of determination, but it wasn't enough to quell the doubts creeping into his mind. The whispers of disbelief, the sideways glances, the outright dismissals, they all weighed on him, making him question whether he was truly capable of fulfilling the task he'd been given. One night, as he sat alone in his room, the weight of it all finally broke him. Tears streamed down his face as he buried his head in his hands. "They won't listen," he sobbed, his voice barely audible. "They don't believe me." The room was silent except for the sound of his ragged breaths. For the first time since the accident, he felt completely and utterly alone. The town that had once been a close-knit haven now simmered with tension. His warnings had spread like wildfire, turning neighbors into adversaries and families into battlegrounds. On one side were those who believed him, their fear driving them to prepare for the disasters he described. They stockpiled supplies, reinforced their homes, and whispered prayers for salvation. On the other side were the skeptics, who dismissed his visions as the ramblings of a disturbed boy seeking attention. The divide was most evident at the local diner, a place that had long been the town's social hub. Conversations once filled with friendly banter had turned heated. "He's just a kid," barked Mr. Jenkins, slamming his coffee cup on the counter. "What does he know about the future?" "More than you, apparently," shot back Mrs. Reed, her voice sharp. "The storm he warned about happened, didn't it?" "Coincidence," Jenkins muttered, but his tone lacked conviction. The storm had been more violent than any in living memory, and it had shaken even the most skeptical residents. Meanwhile, the local church became a battleground of its own. Father Michael, who had initially been sympathetic, found himself caught in the crossfire. Parishioners demanded that he denounce the boy, accusing him of blasphemy and fear-mongering. "He's playing God," one woman shouted during Sunday service. "He's leading us astray," but others defended him, pointing to the eerie accuracy of his warnings. "What if he's been sent to help us?" a man countered. The congregation erupted into a cacophony of voices, their unity fractured by the boy's predictions. The tension reached a boiling point when one of his visions came to pass in the most chilling way. For weeks he had spoken of fire, an inferno that would consume part of the town. His descriptions were vivid, the smell of smoke, the heat so intense it felt alive, and the sound of panicked cries. "It's coming," he had told anyone who would listen. "You need to be ready." Few had taken him seriously, so when a fire broke out at the old grain mill on the outskirts of town, it caught everyone off guard. The flames spread rapidly, fueled by dry timber and strong winds. By the time the fire department arrived, the blaze had already engulfed several nearby homes. Families fled with what little they could carry, their faces streaked with soot and tears. As the fire raged, those who had dismissed Owen's warnings were forced to confront the possibility that he might be telling the truth. The grain mill's destruction sent shockwaves through the community, sparking a shift in the way people viewed the boy. Some approached him with newfound respect, while others grew increasingly fearful, wary of what his next prediction might bring. In the aftermath of the fire, the town's divisions deepened. Groups formed on either side of the debate, their disagreements spilling over into public spaces. Signs appeared in windows. "We believe Owen" on one street, "Stop the fear-mongering" on another. Even children weren't immune to the conflict, their friendships strained by the opinions of their parents. For Owen, the fire was both a vindication and a burden. He hadn't wanted to be right, hadn't wanted his visions to come true. The sight of the charred remains of the grain mill haunted him, and the guilt of not being able to prevent it gnawed at his soul. He felt the weight of every loss, every tear shed by the families who had lost their homes. Late one night, as he lay in bed, the visions returned with a vengeance. The figure appeared, shrouded in shadow, its presence as imposing as ever. "The tipping point is near," it said, its voice cold and unyielding. "You will face a choice that will determine their fate." Owen's heart raced, his mind reeling from the figure's words. What choice? What fate? The question swirled in his head, but the figure offered no answers. It simply stared, its gaze heavy with expectation, before fading into the darkness. When Owen awoke, the sense of urgency was sharper than ever. He knew he had to act, but how could he guide a town so fractured, so consumed by fear and doubt? The task felt insurmountable, but deep down, he understood that giving up was not an option. The visions were a warning, and he was the messenger. Whether they listened or not, he had to keep trying. Some believed Owen, and others didn't, but the danger around him was growing and hard to ignore. The weight of a final warning. The world dissolved into an all-encompassing darkness. The now familiar pull returned, leaving his body weightless as the void gave way to a vision unlike anything experienced before. The earth trembled beneath his feet, splitting open in jagged, fiery chasms. Rivers overflowed with torrents of blackened water, swallowing entire towns in their wake. The sky above, once vast and blue, was cloaked in a suffocating gray, lightning tearing across it in violent streaks. Cries of humanity echoed in every direction, desperate, heart-wrenching, and unending. People clutched their loved ones as the ground quaked, their faces masks of terror and despair. Fires raged, consuming forests and cities alike, while oceans surged, drowning the last remnants of safety. His chest tightened as he watched the destruction unfold, every detail sharper, more vivid than the last. "Why are you showing me this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The figure appeared once more, its presence commanding and unwavering. It stood tall amidst the destruction, untouched by the surrounding chaos. "This is what lies ahead," it said, its voice resonating with a solemn gravity, "the consequence of humanity's choices." He turned to the figure, fists clenched. "It can't end like this," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "There has to be another way. Please tell me there's something I can do." The figure's gaze bore into him, piercing and unwavering. "That depends on them," it said. "Humanity holds the power to change its path, but the willingness to do so is rare. The choices they make now will decide their fate." His shoulders sagged under the weight of the words. The scenes around him shifted again, showing glimpses of people acting out of greed, anger, and indifference. A leader stood on a podium, shouting words that divided instead of united. Factories pumped thick plumes of smoke into the air, choking the life from the land. A child wept alone in a darkened alley, ignored by the passers-by who could have offered help. "Why me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why was I chosen to see all this?" The figure stepped closer, its shadowy form radiating an air of authority. "Your life was never random," it said. "From the moment you were born, your path was set. Your accident, your death, your return, all of it was part of the plan. You were chosen to carry this warning because you have the strength to bear it." Tears welled in his eyes as the weight of the revelation settled over him. "I'm just a kid," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How can I make them listen?" The figure gestured, and the scenes around them changed once more. This time they were not of destruction, but of hope. A man stopped to help an elderly woman cross a busy street, his kindness sparking a ripple of good deeds among those who witnessed it. A group of volunteers worked tirelessly to rebuild homes after a storm, their unity defying the devastation. A child shared their meal with the stray dog, their small act of compassion radiating warmth and light. "There is still hope," the figure said, its voice softer now. "Small acts of kindness and faith can tip the balance. Humanity is capable of great good, but they must choose it willingly." He nodded slowly, the glimpses of hope filling him with a renewed sense of purpose. The visions were not just warnings, they were also a call to action, a reminder of the potential for change, but the responsibility still felt overwhelming, the stakes impossibly high. "What if they don't listen?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What if it's not enough?" The figure's gaze hardened, its tone turning stern. "Then they will face the consequences of their choices," it said. "Warn them one last time. The rest is up to them." The words echoed in his mind as the vision began to fade. The chaos and destruction dissolved into darkness, replaced by a blinding light that enveloped him. He felt himself being pulled back, the weight of the figure's warning pressing heavily on his heart. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his room, the faint glow of dawn creeping through the window. His body felt heavy, his mind racing with the enormity of what he had seen. The figure's words echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of the task that lay ahead. Warn them one last time. The morning was heavy with an eerie stillness, as though the world itself were holding its breath. He stood in the town square, a makeshift podium, hastily constructed beneath the old clock tower. A crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and thinly veiled fear. He felt the weight of their stares, their doubts pressing down on him like an anchor. But he knew this was his moment, the final chance to deliver the warning he had been entrusted with. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, his small frame dwarfed by the podium. His voice, though trembling at first, grew steady as he spoke. "I know many of you don't believe me," he began, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "I know you think I'm just a kid, that what I've said sounds impossible or insane. But I'm not here to argue or convince you. I'm here because I've seen what's coming, and I can't stay silent." He described the visions with vivid detail, sparing nothing. The earth splitting open, skies darkened by ash, and oceans rising to swallow entire cities. He spoke of the cries of despair he had heard, the desperate pleas for forgiveness that came too late. His words painted a grim picture, one that sent shivers through those who were listening. Yet, even as some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, others rolled their eyes or whispered dismissively to one another. "You have a choice," he said, his voice rising with urgency. "We all do. The future isn't set in stone, but the path we're on is leading us to disaster. We can change it, but only if we act now. Small acts of kindness, faith, and unity, they matter more than you know." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, their faces thoughtful, while others scoffed openly. "This is ridiculous," a man near the back called out. "We're supposed to take life advice from a kid who nearly died and thinks he's some kind of prophet?" "He's just trying to scare us," another voice added. Laughter followed, harsh and dismissive. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. He had expected resistance, but the mockery still stung. He pressed on, directing his words to those who seemed willing to listen. "I don't want to scare you," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I want to help you see that there's still hope, but that hope depends on all of us working together, on choosing to do what's right instead of what's easy." Before he could continue, a low rumble interrupted him. At first it seemed distant, like the growl of a far-off storm, but it grew louder, the ground beneath their feet trembling slightly. The crowd fell silent, their attention shifting to the horizon. Dark clouds gathered with unnatural speed, their edges tinged with an ominous red. A sharp, cold wind swept through the square, carrying with it the metallic scent of ozone. Panic spread like wildfire. People turned to one another, their voices rising in confusion and fear. "What's happening?" someone shouted. "Is this part of his warning?" His heart raced as he watched the scene unfold. This was it, the moment he had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. The visions were coming to life, their reality undeniable. He climbed onto the podium, raising his voice to be heard over the chaos. "This is what I've been trying to tell you," he shouted. "It's starting, but it's not too late. We can still make a difference. Please, listen to me." Some in the crowd heeded his words, dropping to their knees in prayer or reaching out to comfort one another. Others fled, their fear driving them to seek shelter wherever they could. The divide that had plagued the town was laid bare in those frantic moments, a stark reminder of the choices each person faced. The rumbling intensified, the ground shaking violently beneath them. Cracks formed in the pavement, splitting the square in jagged lines. The old clock tower groaned under the strain, its foundation crumbling as debris rained down. Owen stood firm, his small figure a beacon of resolve amidst the chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the trembling stopped. The dark clouds remained, but the air grew eerily still. The crowd looked around in stunned silence, their faces a mix of relief and unease. Owen felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would finally understand. But the figure's voice echoed in his mind, cutting through his thoughts like a knife. "The choice is theirs," it said, its tone as unyielding as ever. "You have done your part. Now we wait." Owen stepped down from the podium, his legs weak and his heart heavy. The crowd began to disperse, some lingering to talk in hushed tones while others hurried away. He could see the uncertainty in their faces, the internal battle between belief and doubt. It wasn't the clear victory he had hoped for, but it wasn't a total loss either. As he walked home, Owen's thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. He had given everything he had, poured his heart into the warning, and still, the outcome was uncertain. The weight of the responsibility pressed down on him, but he clung to the glimmers of hope he had seen, the small acts of faith, the moments of unity that hinted at the possibility of change. That night, as he lay in bed, the final words of the figure echoed in his mind. The choice is ours, but time is running out. Even with help from others, the strange things happening to Owen were becoming harder to face. The light left in his absence. The days after his final warning passed in a haze of unease. He had hoped his message would unite the community, spark change, and ignite a collective desire to alter their path. Instead, it seemed to have awakened something darker. Strange things began to happen, subtle at first, like the faint sound of whispers when he was alone or the feeling of being watched, but soon these occurrences grew impossible to ignore. It started one night as he sat in his room staring at the notebook where he'd written his visions. The pages began to flutter, though there was no breeze. The overhead light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. He froze, his breath hitching, as the whispers returned, louder this time. They spoke in fragmented words, incomprehensible yet menacing. He shut the notebook, shoving it into a drawer, but the voices didn't stop. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Silence followed, heavy and oppressive, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, his dreams were filled with shadowy figures, their forms indistinct, but their presence suffocating. They didn't speak, but their intentions were clear. They wanted him to stop. The next morning, his mother found him pale and shaken at the breakfast table. "Are you feeling all right, sweetheart?" she asked, concern etched on her face. He nodded weakly, unwilling to share what he had experienced. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? As the days turned into weeks, the phenomena escalated. Objects in his room would shift inexplicably. His alarm clock would reset itself to odd times, and the mirror above his dresser cracked without warning. At school, he felt unseen eyes following him, and more than once he thought he saw fleeting shadows in the corners of his vision. He began to dread the nights most of all. Sleep offered no refuge, only more visions of the shadowy figures and the growing sense that they were closing in. One night as he lay in bed, a chilling voice broke the silence. "It's useless, child," it said, low and guttural. He shot upright, his heart pounding. The room was empty, yet the voice persisted. "They won't change. You're wasting your time." "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice breaking, but the voice only laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed in his ears long after it stopped. He buried his face in his hands, trying to block out the sound, but the sense of despair it brought lingered. The more these occurrences happened, the more he began to doubt himself. What if the voices were right? What if humanity was beyond redemption? His once unshakable resolve wavered, replaced by a gnawing fear that he had been wrong all along. The thought consumed him, leaving him feeling isolated and powerless. He turned to the only source of solace he had left, the figure from his visions. Kneeling by his bed, he clasped his hands together and whispered, "Please, if you're still there, help me. I don't know what to do." The response came not in words, but in a faint warmth that washed over him, a reminder of the light he had once felt so strongly. It steadied him, but the shadows remained, lurking just beyond reach. That night, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. He found himself in a barren wasteland, the ground cracked and lifeless. The air was thick with smoke, and the sky was an unrelenting black. The shadowy figures surrounded him, their forms more distinct now. They had no faces, only voids where eyes and mouths should have been. Their presence was suffocating, their intent clear. "You are nothing," one of them hissed. "Your warnings fall on deaf ears. Humanity is doomed." "No," he said, though his voice wavered. "There's still hope. I've seen it." The figures closed in, their darkness pressing against him. "The light cannot save you now," one snarled, its voice dripping with malice. He tried to move, to run, but his body felt paralyzed. The shadows engulfed him, their coldness seeping into his very core. He woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat and trembling uncontrollably. The echoes of the entity's words lingered in his mind, a chilling reminder of the battle he was fighting. He sat up, clutching the edges of his blanket, his heart pounding. Despite his fear, a spark of defiance burned within him. The light may have felt distant, but it wasn't gone, and as long as it remained, so would his hope. The morning sunlight poured through the thin curtains of his room, casting warm streaks across the walls. It was a rare moment of peace after the storm of shadows and doubts that had plagued him. He sat at his desk, staring at the notebook filled with his warnings, his hands resting on its frayed edges. The weight of his task still hung heavy over him, but there was something different in the air, a faint glimmer of hope that he couldn't quite place. Later that day, as he wandered through the town streets, he noticed a stranger standing near the community center. The man looked out of place, his clothes simple yet neat, and his face calm but intent as he handed out small parcels to those who passed by. Intrigued, he drew closer, watching as the man smiled warmly at a child and pressed a bag of food into the mother's hands. The mother's eyes filled with gratitude, and he felt a strange pull to approach. "You're doing this for free?" he asked, his voice hesitant. The man turned, his gaze meeting his with an intensity that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in weeks. "Of course," the man said, his voice steady and kind. "Everyone needs a little help sometimes, and right now, the world could use all the kindness it can get." His chest tightened, and he nodded slowly. "That's really good of you," he said. For a moment, the weight of his doubts felt lighter. The man studied him closely. "You're the boy who's been warning people about what's coming, aren't you?" He stiffened, unsure of how the man might react. "Yes," he admitted. "That's me." To his surprise, the man's expression softened. "I thought so," he said. "I've heard about you, and I've seen things too, strange things." His eyes widened. "You have?" The man nodded, gesturing for him to follow to a bench nearby. They sat together, and the man began to speak. He described vivid dreams of a fractured world and a voice urging him to act, to do what he could to bring people together and counter the darkness. "I don't know why I've been shown these things," he said, "but I do know that even the smallest act of goodness can make a difference." For the first time in what felt like forever, Owen felt understood. Here was someone who didn't dismiss him, someone who had seen glimpses of the same truth. The man's words resonated deeply, reigniting the spark of determination within him. Over the next few days, Owen spent more time with the man, whose name was Samuel. Together, they worked to spread kindness in small but meaningful ways, helping neighbors repair damaged homes, delivering food to those in need, and simply listening to the worries of others. Owen began to see how even the simplest gestures could brighten someone's day, how acts of faith and compassion created ripples that reached far beyond their immediate impact. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange, Samuel turned to Owen. "You've been given a gift," he said. "It's not an easy one to carry, but it's important. Don't let the darkness convince you otherwise." Owen looked out at the fading light, his heart swelling with a newfound sense of purpose. "I won't," he said quietly. "I can't." That night, as Owen lay in bed, he thought about all he had seen and done. The doubts still lingered, but they no longer felt insurmountable. He realized that his warnings weren't just about avoiding disaster. They were about inspiring change, about showing people that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there was always a way to push back. The next morning, he stood in the town square once more, his voice steady as he addressed the gathering crowd. "I know it's hard to believe," he said, "but we can make a difference. Every kind word, every selfless act, every moment of faith, it all matters. We don't have to be consumed by fear or hatred. We can choose to be better." The crowd listened, some nodding, others watching silently. Owen's heart pounded, but he pressed on. "I may be small," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "but even the smallest light can push back the dark." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Owen felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that as long as there was even a single spark of hope, the fight wasn't over. The morning was anything but ordinary. The sky was a chaotic mix of swirling gray clouds, their edges tinged with an unnatural red. The air was heavy with an electric charge, making every breath feel like an effort. Owen stood in the town square, surrounded by a community that had once been divided, but now looked to him with a singular hope. They had seen enough to believe, the storm, the fire, and the whispers of warnings that had proven true. Yet belief wasn't enough. Now they needed guidance, and Owen knew the weight of their lives rested squarely on his small shoulders. "This is it," he thought, clutching the notebook that had been his companion throughout this ordeal. Inside were the scribbled remnants of his visions, the fragments of a problem he still struggled to piece together. The crowd around him was restless, murmuring prayers and questions, their fear palpable. And then, as if on cue, the earth trembled. A deep, resonant rumble spread through the ground, shaking windows and causing the old clock tower to sway precariously. Screams erupted, and people clutched each other for stability. Owen's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was the moment he had seen in his visions, the one that had always marked the tipping point. He climbed onto the podium, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is what I've been warning you about. The time has come to make a choice." The murmurs died down, replaced by an uneasy silence as all eyes turned to him. Owen swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their expectations. "We've been given a chance," he continued, "a chance to change, to prove that we can be better, but it's up to us. Fear, hatred, and selfishness brought us to this point. Love, unity, and faith can pull us back." Before he could say more, the sky darkened further, and a deafening crack split the air. Lightning arced across the heavens, striking a tree at the edge of the square and setting it ablaze. The crowd panicked, some running for shelter, others dropping to their knees in prayer. Owen felt the familiar tug of doubt creeping in, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't falter now. At that moment, a figure emerged from the crowd. It was Samuel, his presence steady and grounding amidst the turmoil. He placed a reassuring hand on Owen's shoulder. "You're not alone in this," Samuel said, his voice calm and resolute. "We're with you." The words bolstered Owen's courage. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, addressing the crowd once more. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about all of us. If we want to stop this, we have to stand together. We have to choose to be better, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that come after us." As he spoke, the ground trembled again, this time more violently. Buildings creaked and groaned, and cracks spidered across the pavement. The air was thick with smoke and ash, making it difficult to see or breathe. Owen's mind raced. He knew what had to be done, but the enormity of it made his stomach churn. The figure from his visions appeared then, standing at the edge of the square. It was as imposing as ever, its shadowy form seeming to absorb the chaos around it. Owen's gaze met his piercing eyes, and he felt an unspoken challenge pass between them. The figure's presence was a reminder of the stakes, of the choice that lay before him. "You know what must be done," the figure's voice echoed in his mind, "but the choice is yours alone." Owen turned back to the crowd, his heart heavy. He could feel the tears welling in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. "I've tried to warn you," he said, his voice breaking. "I've done everything I could to help you see what's at stake. Now, it's up to you to decide. Do we fight for a better future, or do we let everything crumble?" The crowd erupted into chaos once more, voices clashing as people debated and argued. Some shouted words of encouragement, while others wept openly. A few turned away, their faces etched with resignation. Owen's heart ached as he watched, knowing that he couldn't make the choice for them. As the tremors grew stronger, Samuel stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Listen to the boy," he said, his tone firm. "He's been right about everything so far. If we don't act now, it'll be too late." Slowly, the crowd began to quiet, their attention shifting back to Owen. He took a shaky breath and stepped down from the podium, walking to the center of the square. The cracks in the ground seemed to pulse with an ominous light, and the air was thick with tension. Owen knelt, placing his hands on the fractured earth, and closed his eyes. "If this is what it takes," he whispered, "then I'll do it." A sudden burst of light enveloped him, blinding and all-encompassing. The crowd gasped, shielding their eyes as the light grew brighter and brighter. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. Owen was nowhere to be seen. The square was silent, the only sound the faint crackle of the burning tree. In the wake of his disappearance, the tremors stopped, and the sky began to clear. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by a fragile sense of calm. The crowd stood in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. Samuel stepped forward, picking up the notebook Owen had left behind. He opened it to the final page, where a single message was scrawled in Owen's handwriting. "The rest is up to you." The words hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the responsibility they now carried. Slowly, the people began to disperse, their minds racing with what they had witnessed. Some vowed to change, to be better, while others remained skeptical. But one thing was certain: Owen's message had left its mark. The sun was setting over the little town, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and gold. Long shadows stretched across the square, giving everything a calm but serious feel. Samuel stood there, completely still, clutching the notebook tightly against his chest, as if it held something more than words. He raised his eyes to the sky, taking a slow, deep breath, and his heart filled with a steady kind of strength. The boy may have been small and quiet, but his actions had been like a flame, bright enough to push away the shadows around him. That flame wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting to grow. Now, it was up to the rest of them, including Samuel, to protect it and make sure it stayed alive, no matter what challenges came their way. Is Owen's terrifying warning from beyond the grave a sign of something deeper, or is there more to this story than we can even imagine? Could his message be a warning we all need to heed, or is it something darker that's been kept hidden? Let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.